Candy with eyes to Jesus.blogspot.com. And welcome as we continue going through this Christian Women series. And if you're just joining me or you haven't been following along on the series, don't worry, you can just jump in right here. But if you do want to see previous videos in this series, they are in a playlist on my YouTube channel at Eyes to Jesus, and the playlist is called Christian Women. So today we're going to go through the first 16 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And it's going to really pull together a theme that we've kind of been seeing in like our past few videos about mutuality in the marriage. And 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is a very mutual in the marriage chapter. So let's go ahead and get right into this. If you would like to follow along with me in your Bible, feel free to use whatever Bible translation you prefer or have in front of you. Today I will be using the NRSVUE. That's a New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Okay, so let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And first, let's read the verses that we're going to study. That's verses 1 through 16. And that says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife what is due her, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer. And then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. To the unmarried and to the widows I say that it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I and not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce the husband. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through the brother. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, a brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called us. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife." So let's get into this very powerful chapter that is very not known. This chapter rarely seems to be preached or taught about, and perhaps that's because this chapter overall is very sexual in nature. But isn't that a very big part of marriage? There's nothing taboo here or wouldn't be in the Bible. This is something that Christians are supposed to be taught and that Christians are supposed to know. So chapter 7 verse 1, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." It is good for a man not to touch a woman here is in quotes, because Paul is quoting what the Corinthian church wrote to him in a letter. Now, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That was a teaching from some of the Grecian teachers. Some Grecian moral teachers would teach that you all just be abstinent. Don't get married. Don't have any sexual relations. Just be abstinent. So they taught it is good that a man does not touch a woman. And then there were other Greek philosophers who were like, yeah, I think not getting married is a good idea, but sometimes you're just going to be burned in a flame, and then you have to get those urges handled. So go to prostitutes for that. You get that handled. Once that's out of the way and you feel better, now you can resume the path of righteousness. Says, don't get married, right? So those were two teachings that were going around. Full abstinence and not getting married, or not getting married, and when you can't contain, go to a prostitute and get that urge out of the way, and then remain as you were unmarried. And so the Corinthians were likely asking Paul about that in their letter to him, since those were two teachings going around at that time. So Paul is going to get into this. All right, so he's looking at, all right, so they need to be taught, and the Christian body in general, that's why it's in the Bible, needs to be taught about sexual sins and marriage and where all this lies. Okay, so verse 2. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So sexual immorality is to be tied into that it's good for a man not to touch a woman, that they were telling to him. Sexual immorality, other translations will say fornication. Sexual immorality means sexual sin. In regards to fornication, which is what it means here, it means sex outside of marriage. It means having sexual relations with someone that you're not married to. It doesn't have to be the full-blown thing that can create a baby. It can just be acts that can lead up to or before that final act, or in the place of it. It's any type of sexual relations with someone that you are not in a marriage with. So Paul is saying that so that you don't fall into sexual immorality, that each man should have his own wife. That means if this man is in danger of sexual immorality and or he desires to get married, he should get married. But he should have his own wife. His own wife means that she shares his body only with him. She is his wife. She doesn't act like a wife to other men. She does not prostitute herself. Also, his own wife means she is not to be a polygamist. She's not to have multiple husbands. She has one husband. So she's his own wife. She's not his wife and then the wife of her other husbands. She's his own wife. And then the second part of that verse says, and each woman her own husband. So it used to be fairly accepted in Greek culture that if a Greek man got married and he wasn't fully satisfied with his wife, or he wanted more, or he wanted variety, that it was okay for the Greek man to go out and seek prostitutes and to sleep with other people. But it was not societally okay for the wife to. The wife was not allowed to. Now, some of them would prostitute themselves on the side, but the wife was not allowed to, but it was accepted. That's normal, and it's okay if the husband played around. But notice what it's saying here, and each woman her own husband. So he is her husband. He does the marital act with her only. He's not going out and being physical and committing sexual immorality with anyone else. He is her own husband. It also means he is not a polygamist. He's not taking on multiple wives, because if he were, he's not her own husband. He's her husband and also the husband of her sister wives. That would be sharing a husband. No, he's her own husband. So 1 Corinthians 7 verse 2 is actually a fabulous verse for those who are wondering if there's polygamy in Christianity. And this gives the answer right there. That because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Now, okay, so we're talking about, all right, so you should get married to avoid sexual immorality. So what about, is it good for a man to touch a woman? So what about that in marriage? What are the rules for that now in marriage? Okay, so you have your own husband, you have your own wife. Now, what are the touching rules, right? Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife what is due her. So what does it mean, what is due her? It means sex within the marriage. That's the topic of this whole section, is sexual immorality versus should a man touch a woman in marriage, outside of marriage, etc. But notice it's saying the husband should give to his wife what is due her. So this is talking about conjugal rights within the marriage. And the Bible teaches that there are conjugal rights within the marriage. So the wife has the conjugal rights to her husband. So that means that the husband is to render those conjugal rights to his wife when she so desires. And then the second part of this verse, and likewise the wife to her husband. So the wife is also to render those conjugal rights to her husband. So there's some people and they're manipulative, and when they are mad at their spouse or their spouse isn't doing what they want them to do, they withhold those conjugal rights. That is a sin, and that's against the scriptures. All right, so now verse 4 goes even more. Now, let's just stop here really quick because this is interesting. You know, in a previous videos in this series, I hope I've really driven home the point and shown you that the Bible nowhere teaches that the husband has authority over the wife. Now, there is actually one place where it does teach that the husband has authority over the wife, okay, and that's here. So this place, it is going to talk about an authority that the husband has over the wife, and it is the Greek word exousia. So let's see, what is this? It's the only place in the Bible that says, as a command, as a prescription, not a description, of the husband having authority over his wife. Verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. The husband in the marriage relationship has authority over his own wife's body. And what's the main context of this? Sexually, conjugal rights. All right? Now, patriarchalists will actually quote this verse, and just this part. This is only half of the verse, but they don't seem to pay attention to the other half because there's mutuality there. And the patriarchalists, they ignore the mutuality in the marriage. All right, so it's the second half of the verse. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. The husband has authority over the wife's body, and the wife has authority over the husband's body. So while the main context of that is within the realm of conjugal rights, that could also go towards other realms that help physically with conjugal rights. For example, I've leaned towards considering getting a nose ring. Well, my husband has authority over my body, and my husband absolutely does not want me to get a nose ring. Okay, he has authority over my body. I'm not going to get the nose ring. My husband's talked about shaving his head. Well, I have authority over my husband's body, and I put the kibosh on that. No, I like your hair. You're not shaving your head. It's a mutual authority. Yeah, in the marriage, the husband has authority over the wife's body, but likewise, the wife has authority over the husband's body. Now, this word, likewise, it's also translated in like manner. It's the same thing. This is a mutuality word. Likewise, or in like manner, a mutuality phrase. So where did we see this mutuality phrase at? We saw it in 1 Peter chapter 3, where it talks about how a believing wife submits to her unbelieving husband and hoping and trying to save him. And then it goes into, and likewise, the husband to the wife. So as the wife submits to the husband, likewise, the husband to the wife. There's that mutuality in submission. We also see that mutuality of submission in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. Okay, so remember, we're still on the topic here of conjugal rights in the marriage, right? So verse 5. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, throughout this chapter, when he's talking about self-control, it's in this chapter, it's always within reference of sexual self-control or controlling passions and lusts physically. Okay, so what if you don't want to and your spouse wants to? Well, your body is their body. Now, if you're sick, for example, well, then remember, we're supposed to love others as we love ourselves. If your spouse is sick and you want to, and they're sick and they don't want to, maybe you should not want to until they get better, right? Because what if you were sick and they wanted to, and you felt like you were a dying dog? This is not very fun, right? But otherwise, what does it say here? It says, don't deprive one another. Men, you are not to deprive your wives of conjugal rights. Women, you are not to deprive your husbands of conjugal rights. But if you do, it has to be an agreement, meaning you both have to willingly agree to the deprivation. And it can only be for a set time. It can't be for very long. And during that set time, it should be so that you can devote yourselves to prayer. But then, after that set time, you need to come together again. Why? So that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So that one of you or both of you doesn't go out and commit adultery. Because humans, not all, we'll get into that in this chapter, gets into that, but most humans have that passion, desire. God made us this way, and it's supposed to be one of the most best parts of marriage. When people are running around doing the best part of marriage with multiple partners without being married, they're degrading the act. And by degrading the act, they are not even getting as much joy and pleasure out of it as was meant to be. When you do it God's way, you're going to get the ultimate joy and pleasure out of it. What you're getting with the sexual immorality outside of marriage, that's minute. When you are in the marriage covenant and you are in the Lord, that act is so much more. And the fornicators are missing it. They're degrading it and they are missing it. Okay, so we're in the marriage bed. That's a term, that's a scriptural term of a kind of a cleaner, more PG way of saying your conjugal rights or sex within the marriage bed, right? So sexual acts within the marriage is undefiled. Sexual acts outside of the marriage is a defilement. So let's go to a scripture that talks about that. Let's turn to the book of Hebrews chapter 13 verse 4. Okay, so Hebrews 13 verse 4. Let marriage be held in honor by all. In honor by all. So marriage being held in honor by the husband and wife, but that their marriages be honored by other people too. So a person should not be trying, an unmarried person, for example, should not be trying to get a married person to sleep with them or do acts with them. Then that unmarried person is not honoring that person's marriage. Or even a married person trying to cross over into someone else's marriage physically, you're not honoring that person's marriage. But let marriage be held in honor by all. And let the marriage bed be kept undefiled. Okay, so the marriage bed be kept undefiled. So you're rendering what is due to each other and you're not withholding. All right, so how do you defile the marriage bed? For God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterers. Adultery is another form of sexual immorality. So you have fornication, which is sex outside of marriage. And then you have adultery. You have other forms of sexual immorality and adultery, by the way, especially prevalent in today's modern culture. A big one being pornography. So let's turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 5. And let's take a look at verses 27 and 28. And this is Jesus speaking. And he says, "You have heard what it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So men looking at pornography or having impure thoughts about other women, They're already committing adultery in their hearts. Now, what if they're not married? Then are they committing adultery in their hearts? Yes, because they're committing adultery in their hearts against their future spouse. They're again defiling their future conjugal rights within the marriage bed. They're cheapening something that was supposed to be sacred. It's supposed to be a gift that God gives to the husband and wife. So when you cheapen it and when you defile it, you're never going to get the ultimate experience of it. You're going to experience a shadow of it, a shard of it. You're not going to actually get the total package. You're not going to get the fullness of it. You're cheapening it, you're defiling it, you're only getting a little piece of what it actually is and what it is actually meant to be. Now, people will say, well, notice it just says it's a man looking at a woman and lusting after her. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that women can't look at men and lust after them. Or what if the man is looking at a man and lusting after him? Or woman is looking at a woman and lusting after her? Okay, this is inclusive. It's giving one example, but it's supposed to be meant in all realms. It's supposed to mean don't look at someone with lust in your heart. So, and then we see this way where it just gives one side, but it means to both sides. In a lot of the translations, for example, of 1 Timothy chapter 3, where, for example, it's talking about deacons and bishops or overseers in the church. And it'll say, for example, with the deacon, it says with the bishop too. But you giving the deacon, for example, it'll say that the deacon is to be the husband of one wife. Now, the NRSV and the NRSV UE and the Common English Bible, they will say something along the lines of have only one spouse. Because the husband of one wife is supposed to mean that they're not polygamous. But it doesn't mean, people will run with that and say, see, so only men can be deacons and bishops. Yet 1 Timothy 3 verse 11 gives specific instructions to female deacons. And we read about female bishops or pastors in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verses 16 and 17 and in Romans chapter 16 verses 1 through 2. And with Pastor Chloe in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 11, we got Pastor Phoebe. We've got Pastor Priscilla. We've got Pastor Nympha. So we've got all these women pastors in the Bible. So it's clear that just like here, where it's saying, okay, so just like men aren't to lust after women, it's a given. It means the other way too. Women aren't to lust after men. Just like deacons and pastors or bishops or elders or overseers, whatever your Bible translation says, are to be the husband of only one wife, it's meant the other way too. That the female deacon or pastor is to be the wife of only one husband. She too is not to be polygamous. And we saw that exclusive language against polygamy for both the husband and the wife in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 already in our study. So let's flip back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and let's pick up where we left off. Okay, so remember verse 5 was, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a set time to devote yourselves to prayer. And then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So many cases of straying towards pornography or sexting or even physical adultery could be prevented if the husband and wife had a healthy marriage bed, if they were both willingly and joyfully rendering what is due to each other. All right, verse 6. This I say by way of concession, not of command. So that ends with a period there at that sentence, and I personally think it should be a colon, because now Paul is introducing something that he's going to say. That's his opinion. Okay, and he says, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. So as he is what? We can pick that up as we keep reading verse 8. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. So now we know that when Paul says that he wishes that the others could be as he is, he's wishing for singleness. All right. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. And notice that Paul called this a gift, a particular gift from God. This is where we get the doctrine of the gift of singleness. Some people are genuinely asexual. They don't have any passion or desire for either gender, nothing at all. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that person. It is okay to be asexual. It's a gift, and it's called the gift of singleness. Now, some asexual people still desire to get married and have a platonic partner in life. But Paul is basically saying here, if you're asexual, don't look into getting into a marriage. Or if you're a widow, don't look into getting remarried. But if you're not asexual and you are struggling with self-control, then it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. Don't burn in your lust then. Get married. But some people have the gift of asexuality. They don't burn aflame in any passion. And he's saying to them, don't get married then. So he's suggesting that they stay single. Verse 10, to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. And again, I would put a colon there. So now we're back to a command from the Lord. That the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Now, throughout this chapter, divorce and separate are used synonymously, and they mean divorce. So, again, we have this mutuality. It's saying that the wife shouldn't divorce her husband and the husband shouldn't divorce his wife. All right, but if you do separate or divorce, remain unmarried, and that also means remaining sexually pure, or be reconciled to your spouse and fix that marriage. Verse 12, to the rest I say, I and not the Lord. So now Paul's saying, okay, here's what I say. That if any brother, now where it says brother here, it's talking about not a physical genetic brother. It's talking about a man who is a believer in Christ. That if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Hold on. We're talking about a believing Christian man with an unbelieving Christian wife. I believe that this must be the case where both the man and woman were unbelievers and then they got married. And one of them got saved and the other one didn't. Because the Bible's pretty clear that Christians are to only marry other Christians, that Christians are not to marry unbelievers, because it calls that unequally yoked. You're not to be in any type of close relationship or partnership with an unbeliever. So to see that in the scriptures, let's turn to 2 Corinthians, and we want to go to chapter 6. And let's take a look at verse 14. And that says, do not be mismatched with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and lawlessness have in common? Or what partnership is there between light and darkness? So where the NRSV UE says mismatched, a lot of other Bible translations will say unequally yoked. So mismatched works as well. But unequally yoked is giving you the picture of 2 oxen pulling on a yoke. But one oxen is way stronger and faster. The other oxen's kind of, sick and weak and holding back. So they're not plowing the field together equally. But mismatched, same thing. It's a mismatch. So do not be mismatched with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and lawlessness have in common? Or what partnership is there between light and darkness? Christians are children of the light. We walk in the light of Christ, who is the light of the world. And Jesus says, as Christians, we are to let our light shine because Christ is in us, shining through us, and we shouldn't quench that. But it teaches that those who are not saved, they walk in darkness. They try to hide their evil deeds and their sins, but you can't hide anything from God. So let's turn back again to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. All right. So again, to the rest I say at verse 12, I and not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So if the husband is a believer and the wife is not, probably the husband and wife both married as unbelievers, but the husband became a Christian, but the wife didn't, he's not to divorce her for that. Verse 13, And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce the husband. So mutuality, same thing. If the woman became a Christian in the marriage, but the husband did not, the wife is not to divorce her husband. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through the brother or husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So, in other words, it's like this is a kind of a callback to ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness in the Old Testament. It's referring to a holy sanctification, that even though only one spouse got saved and the other one isn't saved, the children that come from the union are still sanctified as holy in a Christian family, because the believing spouse then will take up the command given in both Old and New Testaments to raise up your children in the Lord. Verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called us. So you both were unbelievers and you got married. You got saved, but your spouse didn't. You are not to divorce them for that, even though you're not supposed to be unequally yoked together. You will, your spouse, your unbelieving spouse, and your children will be sanctified through you. However, if the unbelieving spouse wants to leave you, let them leave and let them divorce you, because a brother or sister is not bound in such a case, as we read about in verse 15. Okay, verse 16. Now, let's see, verse 16 is going to wrap up the whole, okay, you became a believer, but your spouse is an unbeliever. How come the believer can't divorce the unbeliever, but the unbeliever can divorce the believer? Verse 16 explains it. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. And it could take years. You never give up trying. You never give up trying. Just like as Christian parents, if any Christian parent has a child who backslid from Christ or who never got saved, does that Christian parent ever give up on their child getting saved? Doesn't that Christian parent continually pray? Doesn't that Christian parent continue to try to be a good influence? Doesn't that Christian parent, even if it takes their whole life, continue to work towards doing anything and everything they can to, in hopes that their child would get saved? It's the same thing in the marriage. If you're the believer and your spouse is an unbeliever, aren't you going to continue to model what a good Christian is in hopes that a seed is planted, that eventually maybe that seed will grow and eventually that person will get saved? When my husband and I were first dating, I was the first one to get saved. He saw the change and the growth in me, and that's what led him to also make a decision for Christ. So this chapter, 1 Corinthians 17, verses 1 through 16, what a fabulous chapter on mutuality. And what an important chapter to really explain the concept of conjugal rights, and that the Bible teaches conjugal rights to both spouses equally. Have a blessed day.